My gosh, I'm very excited to be here today. Thank you to everybody here joining us. I've been a little bit nervous and very excited to do this, and I just want to say a massive, massive thank you to you, Douglas, so much for joining me today and for being such a wonderful partner in helping me launch the Service95 Book Club. It's just been, your support and everything you've done has been so amazing, and I just couldn't be happier to have Shuggie Bain as our first book for book club. You've just been so generous and gracious with all your time and all the exclusive content that you've done for us, which everyone can find on service95.com and also on our socials. So yes, thank you so much. And I'd like to start by talking a little bit about why I love Shuggie Bain so much and why it means so much to me. And it's obviously a tough read. And I do have a bit of a track record for liking quite emotionally traumatic books. It explores themes of alcohol abuse, toxic masculinity, queer identity, and I guess for me, the true anchor and the thing that I was connected to the most was this unconditional love between Agnes, Shuggie's mother, and Shuggie. And I think there's just such a beautiful through-line story through everything that happens, through all the darkness, it really kind of shines through. And there's actually a reviewer said about you, said he shows us a lot of monstrous behavior, but not a single monster, only damage. And we'll come back to that, I'm sure. But first, I actually really wanted to start by setting the scene of where you were when you first started work on this book. You grew up on a housing estate similar to the one in the book. But since leaving for New York in your early 20s, you've really lived a life of contrast. You had a very enviable and I imagine pretty glamorous career in the fashion industry. You were working as a senior designer for Calvin Klein and Banana Republic, and I guess you were doing that by day, and then by night, you were writing a story of deprivation in 1980s Glasgow. What drew you back to that?
Oh, insanity, I think,
Yeah.
first of all, yeah. But actually, before I answer that, let me please just say thank you to you, Dua, for just being such a champion of books and of readers and of writers. Your passion for books is so infectious, and I think all writers are so grateful for what you do to bring more readers to our work. So thank you, and thank you for creating this space for us.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Yeah, you know, I grew up in Glasgow, as you said, and I grew up on a couple of different housing estates, and I was so proud to be working class as a kid, but I was taught from the very early age to be ashamed of being poor and of the addiction that was at home with my family, also because I was gay in a very patriarchal place. And so there was just so much silence in my life. There was not a time between the ages of 4 and maybe 26 where I felt like I could reveal my whole entire self. And so there was just so much silence there, even in the community that knew me best of all. But by the time I go to college and I study textiles, which becomes fashion, which takes me to New York, I found my entire self erased. Everybody that ever met me thought I just had this really glamorous life and that maybe I came from a background of privilege or that I was in the place that I was supposed to be in. It had always been such a fight for me to be there. And so it was actually at the height of my fashion career that I sat down to write Shuggie Bain. But I think I wrote it as a manifesto for myself, just to be very clear, even to my husband, even to very good friends of mine, who had never had any other way to tell them that I'd grown up and I'd lost my mother to addiction when I was a kid, or what it was like to be bullied, or what it was like not to have food in the house, and all these other things. And I wanted to capture it as a way to make sense of myself, because I felt like a man in two very broken parts and not a whole person. And at the same time, my family in Glasgow couldn't really understand my life in New York because it was so far away from their daily life. And so I felt like I was forever crossing borders, and I didn't want to feel like I was hiding parts of myself anymore.
You've spoken about, you know, the writing process for Shuggie Bain, and I think if I remember correctly, it took you 10 years to write it. And the manuscript originally ran to 1,800 pages.
Yeah.
And I think...
Single-spaced.
And there was also about 20 drafts of the book. I mean, it probably went into the high 20s.
Yeah.
What was it about this book that needed 10 years? Like, how did you manage to maintain confidence over such a long period of time that you felt that you were actually going to end up with something that really worked?
Yeah. You know, I didn't have confidence. I lost confidence many times, but the book wouldn't let me give up on it because it was so integral to me as a person. And in fact, you know, there were many times where I would write something that was quite difficult and I had to put the book away for a couple of months. What would happen is it would burn out of me, this sort of very honest or true scene or something that a character would do would come out of me very quickly, and I thought, oh, I can't face that again, and I would put it away. And so it ebbed and flowed over the 10 years. But I was also a kid that grew up in a neighborhood that, you know, nobody around me would ever imagine that I would ever go into books or to literature. There weren't any books at home, which is why you and your influence is so important to me. You know, we didn't grow up reading, and I think young working class men still have a tough time coming to books in that way. And so I didn't have confidence, and I was learning as I went on, and I was teaching myself how to write, and I was failing, but failing in private. But I had this hugely creative job where I felt very fulfilled, but I was so unhappy because I wasn't doing what my soul wanted to be doing. And it took a long time even just to give myself permission. You know, Ali Smith said to me recently, she made it very clear to me. She said, I kept saying I was looking for permission from other people, you know. Would other writers think I was a writer? Would the establishment let me in? And she said, no, you were looking for permission from yourself. And I said, yeah, my God, she saw me in a second. But the first draft of the book was 1,800 pages, and when I had no one to read it, and I gave it to my husband. And I said, please, will you read this for me? And he just went, oh my God, no. And he went, but okay, yeah, okay, I will. And he took it into the other room, and it was these 2 huge legal binders, Dua. And I was like in the other room, and I was listening to every sigh and every little bit of laughter, and I thought, oh, he likes it, he likes it. And I went in after 3 hours, and I said, are you finished? And he said, no, I'm not finished. And it took him 8 months to read this. It was like War and Peace. And anytime he was doing anything, and he had a full-time job, anytime he was doing anything that wasn't reading my manuscript, I'd be like, don't you have something you should be doing? But he gave it back to me after all that, after I badgered him. And for the first, 200 pages, he paid such attention to the line level, to the character development. And then about page 300, he just gave up the will to live. And he just started to redact it. And then when he gave me back the thing I'd asked him to do, I didn't speak to him for 7 weeks. I was so offended by it. And so I don't recommend doing that again.
How did you know when the right time was to let go of Shuggie Bain and put it out into the world? When was that turning point for you?
Yeah, it stopped being a sort of creative joy for me. It was a sale that really pulled me through my life for 10 years. I couldn't wait to get through the work week or to get to the weekend or have a couple of days off at Christmas and just do nothing else but write. And then after a while, I realized I emotionally and creatively wasn't moving on. And one thing that people don't know is that I finished Shuggie Bain, and then I went right into writing Young Mungo. Both of these things before I was published, before I ever thought anyone would ever read the books. And so the night that I won the Booker, the very first thing that journalists say to you is, congratulations, but how about that really difficult next book? They're almost dying for you to fail as soon as you've succeeded. And I was like, well, too bad for you, because I've already written my next book. Get it up, you. And so I was like... And so I was just writing the whole time. And really, by the time I came to be published, I'd been writing for about 14 years.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Like, when I think about it differently, obviously, for me, in music terms, when I think about writing an album, for me, it takes me about 2 or 3 years to kind of really get it. But I have to write myself into it. So I have to write a lot of bad songs to get to the good ones and get to a place. But when I think about you writing for 10 years, I almost imagine in my head this crime investigation board of all the different characters and the stories and the backstory and where they were before that and how they progress into the character that they've become. And I really feel like we can't go any further without talking about the real hero of the story, which is Shuggie's mum, Agnes. And when we meet Agnes, while she's still a woman of immense pride and enormous capacity for love and laughter, she's already quite far along the path of self-destruction through drink. And we received a rather wonderful question for you from the Service95 Book Club member, Maggie, who asked, would you do a prequel of Shuggie Bain by diving into Agnes's backstory before her motherhood era? With that in mind, I wonder if you could give us like an insight into Agnes's life before the drink.
Yeah, that's an amazing question. I've never actually been asked that before. So thank you, Maggie, for that. Yeah, you know, I think part of why I wrote the book was as a love story to my own mother. My mother is not Agnes Bain, but I lost my mother to addiction. And I always saw in my mother this woman that was so capable, so loving, so generous, but was very trapped by the circumstances she found herself in, both because she was an uneducated working-class woman that had never been taught to put herself first before her husband or her kids. And so when all that starts to peel away and to fall apart, she really had nowhere to turn. There was no hope within her. And when the city started to come apart, when unemployment, when my father ran out and left her one day, you know, she kind of started to disintegrate inside herself. But what I understood from an early age was that that was not the whole of this woman. This woman was the most wonderful iceberg, and I only ever knew one facet of her. And you're right, she was this wonderful young woman who had so much hope and so much, just had such a bright future and was well loved. And I tried to show that in the novel, but I don't know that I could go back and show more of that. I don't know if after 12 years I have more in it to give. But one thing I do sometimes regret is that I didn't call the book Agnes Bain, because I think truly it is about the mother at the heart of it.
Was there any young Agnes in the earlier drafts?
There was lots of young Agnes, and part of the joy of writing the book was finding out stories through my own family and through, you know, friends of the family to allow me to understand this woman, because when your mother dies at 16, you don't get to know her as an adult, as peers, as friends, whatever you'd like to say. Your relationship is always as a child and a mother. And actually, one of the wonderful things about addiction was that it does tend to sort of break the walls down. It's a very leveler. It means someone who's suffering with addiction treats you in a very direct way and tells you things actually that perhaps mothers wouldn't ordinarily tell children. And so I did get to know some things. But yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things is it's not my family, but you know, there are siblings in it, and I also have siblings. And my siblings, what is fascinating is when a parent has 3 children, she will allow that she will have 3 very different children, but oftentimes we can have 3 different mothers. And my siblings had really happy childhoods. You know, my grandparents were alive. There was 4 wages in the house. They went to Italy once a year, Spain another time. They had really bright, positive childhoods. And then I just intersected in a very different part of my mother's life. She was in her 40s when she had me. The city was at 28% mass unemployment. She'd already come to the end of her romantic life, I think she felt, and so I just had a very different childhood. So maybe my sister should write the story of young Agnes Bain.
It's really interesting. I recently joined a reading group at the Downview Women's Prison in Sutton as a guest of the Books Unlocked programme, which is in partnership between the Booker Prize Foundation and the National Literacy Trust. And it gives people in prisons access to high-quality literature. And it was an incredible experience. We discussed Shuggie Bain, which they'd actually previously chosen as their LGBTQ Book of the Month.
Cool.
And I promised the women that I would bring in some of their questions for you today.
Oh, amazing.
And one of the women drew attention to a really remarkable scene in the book where Agnes is about to confront her slightly snooty neighbor, Colleen, and tell her that she had slept with her husband, Jamesy, in return for her taking Shuggie fishing, which is a promise that he actually never keeps. What follows is extraordinary. And I have a question for you, but first, I wonder if you would read some of that text for us.
Yeah, I absolutely will. I've actually never read this before, so forgive me if I stumble a little bit. But also, there's some raw language in it. So clutch your children, clutch your pearls, clutch the hem of your skirt like Colleen's about to do, if that's what you'd like to do. But yes, Agnes and Colleen are elementally opposed to each other. They're neighbors. They're absolutely identical socioeconomically and generationally, but Agnes has such airs and graces that Colleen, the minute she sees her, hates her. And so there's deep animosity between these women, but in that animosity, there is also deep compassion. Agnes stumbled back to the curb, clumsy with drink. Jamesy swerved deliberately and narrowly missed clipping her with the back tire, the road filled with the usual cloud of soot. Agnes was blinking on the opposite curb, but Colleen hadn't the peace of mind to see her. In her thin face was a wildness and an emptiness, alive and dead at the same time. She fell with a crack to the tarmac and lay, loose-legged and blank-faced, in the dust. Agnes looked up and down the street, like a person who wanted to stick the boot in, or a person who wanted to run away from a car crash. She was unsure which. There was a faint breeze fluttering all the curtains, but no one came to help, no cousins, no other pit women. And silhouetted at the McAvenny window stood the 4 remaining children, lined up in descending heights like little Russian dolls, all with the same sad, beautiful face. One day, Agnes would give them all a deep, hot bath to really stick it into Colleen. From the gutter, there was the loud rip-rip noise of hair being pulled from a brush, a sticky tugging sound, like an old gummy linoleum being torn up. Agnes stepped closer to the flailing woman. The belly full of flat lager, the dust, the tangle of limbs made it hard for her to understand what she was seeing. At first, she thought Colleen was ripping her football top into shreds, but as she stepped closer, Agnes could see the clumps of matted hair the woman was ripping free in each claw. Rip, rip. It came out in wild handfuls. Agnes flitted around the fallen woman. Before she knew it, she was kneeling in the dirt, using her ringed fingers to tame the furious talons. She wrapped herself tightly around Colleen. "Here, what's all this, then?" She said it in a voice so kind that it shocked even her. Colleen went limp in her arms, and Agnes gently lowered the woman's claws into her lap. She prized open the fists, which were still clutching the ripped-out hair, and began pulling the thick strands from between the thin fingers as if she were cleaning an old comb. Colleen's hollow eyes stared into the dirt for a long time before she spoke. "I should have known. I should have left well alone instead of getting on at him while he was down. All I said was I didn't want any more mouths to feed. Since that mine shut, he was coming at me night and day like a teenager on the boil. He was never any use at that pulling out nonsense." Agnes was staring at the bald patches on Colleen's head. There was dust on the blood-pricked scabs. 5 wains is enough for any woman. Colleen snorted. "He would have had 100 if he could, but I just thought, fuck you, McAvenny, and to spite him, I shut the shop." Colleen started to cry again. The tears came in long, thick streams, almost as if she had a leak. They poured down her nose, dripping off her chin, and she turned her eyes towards Agnes and looked at her then as if for the first time. That must have been when he started fucking around. Agnes was conflicted. She would have told any other woman that it would get better in time, even though she knew it would sit on her chest for the rest of her life. But she offered no such salve to Colleen. It occurred to her then that they were equals now, and she couldn't be ashamed at how her insides lifted at the thin woman's bad news. Miners' women were pacing in the street, cousins and the wives of cousins circling nervously as if Colleen had turned into an animal they were unsure of how to approach. She walked up to me, "As nice as you like, with these sunglasses, big fancy ones in 2 shades of brown." She said her name was Elaine, asked if she could have a word in private. I thought she was from the catalogue, thought she was trying to sell me some shite for the Wayne's Christmas. Colleen let out a groan. She uncurled her fingers and took the hem of her skirt. With a single tug, she split the thin fabric in 2 from hem to belly. Then she fell listlessly back onto the pavement. "For the love of God!" Agnes grabbed at the shredded fabric. Colleen had no underwear on. The frizzy hair of her cunt was shocking against the sallow smoothness of her belly. "We've got to get you in the house. Up, up!" Agnes tried to lift her, but she was too uncoordinated with a drink. They toppled over into the stour, and Agnes tore the skin off her knees. She tried to drag Colleen inside, but the wasted woman, nothing but a pile of bones, slackened all her muscles and slid back into the dirt like an unruly child. Agnes stood over her, sweating and spitting. "You can't lie here like that." With her eyes closed, Colleen moved her hand across the dirty pavement like she was caressing fine sheets. The words came out slower and thicker now. "I don't care. Let Jamesy McAvenny hear that his wife died on the road with her old cunt out." There was nervous laughter from some children on bikes. Agnes gave Colleen a hard shake. She found she enjoyed it, so she did it again. "Madam, have you no pride?" Colleen's eyes opened wide and then closed. Her breath grew lighter. "Here, what's getting into you? What have you taken?" But the soft pile of bones did not answer. The fences were hung full of women squawking like big noisy crows. The news had spread fast. Colleen's cousins were screaming blue murder, and James's sisters were throwing their fists in defense of his good name. James's mother, 80 if she was a day, was spitting and swinging a balding mop like it was a scythe. Not knowing what else to do, Agnes drew off her tights and then her own knickers. She did it with a brass neck, stumbling half-cut right there in the street. She struggled to put them on Colleen, and it was like dressing a life-size dolly whose limbs, instead of being stiff and rigid, were limp and heavy with slow blood. Colleen wasn't talking anymore. Agnes sank to the dust beside her. She regarded her expensive white underwear, luminous with good bleach. They hung on the thinner woman like a lacy nappy, and they were, Agnes thought, more kindness than she deserved. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Douglas. Thank you so much for that. That's a really powerful scene. And I wonder if you can dig in a bit on what this scene symbolizes for you, about the relationship between the two women, and also about the status in society of women in this novel.
That's right, yeah. You know, Shuggie comes in quite a long literary tradition of looking at miners' strikes and mass unemployment, but I'd found all the books that I loved had always focused on the heterosexual male experience, because it was our dads and our brothers whose job defined what it was we did, what kind of family we were, and they were the ones put out of work. But I was the son of a single mother, so I was living right in the center of that, but my entire world was feminine. It was my mother. We didn't have a dad at home. And it also meant I was part of a network of other mothers, other single mothers, other women struggling with drink. And so I knew when I was writing Shuggie Bain, I wanted to write the same sort of landscape, but from a very feminine perspective. You know, there is some cruelty towards Agnes from men in the book, but that's almost part of the time. And what I wanted to show was how sometimes, even in communities where we can get into the cliche that working class communities have so much solidarity and we're all in it together, that solidarity comes at the cost of conforming, of fitting in, of being a good mother, of being a decent woman, of going to chapel, of, you know, always putting your kids first. And if you were a woman that had pride in yourself or had notions above your station, or you thought the Scottish word is gallus, then you could be you know, isolated and thought of as terrible. And also, to be honest, the reputation of women was the most valuable currency there, because I knew it certainly as a young boy, but the moment someone said your mother was like this or your mother's that kind of woman, it was terrible. It was world-ending and crushing. And so Shuggie and Agnes are both in isolation. Shuggie can't fit in with the boys because he's too effeminate. And I wanted Agnes not to be able to fit in with the women, because actually she has big ideas and big notions, and she doesn't talk in a regular Glaswegian accent because she thinks of herself as slightly better, and the women can't bear it. There's nothing wrong with the Glaswegian accent, by the way. I wish mine was
actually, the Glaswegian dialect that actually goes through the whole book is really amazing. I feel like while I was reading it, I kept finding myself speaking in a Glaswegian accent in my head, and if I was reading alone in my room, then I would just like quietly say it out loud.
Yeah, are you going to give us it now?
Say it out loud, and I would see if I could get it. But it's good. It's good for practicing a Glaswegian accent for sure. I have another question from Downview, which is an observation really from one of the women in the reading group, who found a lot of resonance between Agnes's experience of Alcoholics Anonymous and that of her own mother's. And there's a period of hope in the novel when Agnes maintains sobriety for a year, and Shuggie says to his friend Leanne, "My mammy had a good year once, it was lovely." During this time, Agnes finds a community within AA, only to see it fall away when she relapses. And in fact, the same thing happens with Eugene, Agnes's boyfriend. And I wonder if these scenes were informed by your own experience growing up, and what have you observed by the way that we treat people with addiction?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. You know, the funny thing about addiction for me is because it was a crisis in community, there was so many people that were suffering, and I was lonely because of my queerness and other things, but I was never lonely within addiction. We always had support of people around us in a way, because other mothers, other fathers were suffering, and then both Alateen and Al-Anon gave us a lot of fellowship. And so in a really strange way, I was never quite alone in it. I think maybe had I been a middle-class family on a street that was flourishing, then the addiction would have felt very, very lonely in that way. But like I said, this is a community as well that can't tell the difference sometimes between a good time and a bad time. It's a very thin line. But my own experience with it as a kid was just the terror and the anxiety you would have when your parent suffered with addiction. You know, it was part of my life from when I was about 3 or 4 years old. I was very aware. And in the time, we didn't have any language like mental health or someone suffering or having other issues. It was just they drank too much and they were a terror. And I knew from about the age of 4 that I was never the most important person in the room, that everything that affected my mother, this woman, would set up everything for the day, whether we had a good day or a bad day. And what that does to a kid is it means you're always compensating, you're always trying to give that person what you perceive they lack. So you're trying to be funny, or you're quieter, or you're neater, or you're better at school, or you don't eat too much, or you eat everything in front of you, whatever you think it is. And the anxiety in that is overwhelming because you're always trying to manage an adult's behavior even before you know really quite what you're doing. But the thing about alcoholism for me as a kid was the terror of it. Because also when people drink, you don't quite know what kind of drunk they're going to be. Sometimes it can be a huge amount of fun. You know, and I would go to school in the morning, I'd come back for lunch, and the house would be full of women. And they were having like a wild party, and you'd be like, it's 11:30. And they were like having a blast. And so as a kid, you just never knew if it was going to be really sad or really funny or really desperate.
Yeah, there's something also really interesting about Alcoholics Anonymous and, you know, the whole idea of like a person finds a community within AA and then it falls away once a person relapses.
That's right.
And I guess that's also because it's a peer-led community group. And although it's really an amazing program, it's also only really there for people that actually want
That's right.
the help.
That's right.
And so I think a lot of people can see similarities, at least this woman at Downview saw a lot of similarities between Agnes and her mother and people kind of walking away when there was substance abuse. And I think sometimes for some people it's almost easier to let go or not be there because it's harder to be there in a way.
Right,
I don't know. It's
you have to want
quite,
it. That's
you have
right,
to, yeah. It's quite like a double-edged sword almost.
That's right. And that's the structure of the book, Dua. You know, I started the story with Agnes surrounded by people that loved her. She's in that flat and all of her childhood friends are there and she's the belle of the ball. She's the most loved woman. And by the end of the novel, everyone peels away because other people's addiction is really hard for us to cope with. And it's hard to, you know, it's hard to witness. It's hard when you cannot help someone you love very deeply get better. And some people, everybody really reaches a point where they have to save themselves. And that's the central question, I think, for Shuggie. You know, how far will he go to save his mother before he has to save himself?
Yeah. I'd be very remiss of us to not talk about the men in Shuggie Bain.
Do we have to?
Yes, we have to. We have to. And I think we should start with Shuggie's own father, Shug.
Yeah.
Does he have any redeemable qualities?
No.
Do you have any sympathy for him?
No. No, I don't. Yeah.
It's, you know, when you think about that time, 1980s, Glasgow, the time of deindustrialization, like everything that was happening, it must have been quite difficult for the men.
That's right.
Of course, too. And then I think about everything that Agnes went through, and I keep, you know, questions that go around in my head. Is Agnes maybe a hard woman to love? Or does she become so as a result of the pain that has happened in her marriage?
Yeah, I think it's the chicken and the egg, and I didn't want to answer that because I felt like they both happen at the same time, and who knows where it begins. In the very first draft of the novel, I'd set the character up that something Shug abandons Agnes, and I'd set that up as a break line, where when he walks out, she turns to drink. But as I did more research and as I spoke to people who really suffered with addiction, I realized that things are never as clean-cut as that. It can be a slow ebbing out of hope, or you can feel very lost over a long period of time. And also, you can be in denial for many years, and people can see it before you can see it yourself. But, you know, I didn't have an awful lot of sympathy for Shug at the beginning of the book. And he's addicted in a way, too. His addiction is he takes an awful lot of his own self-worth from how women adore him. And he's a man who's losing all of his looks, and he probably isn't naturally very charming anyway. But he has a limited power over women. And he treats them appallingly for that. And I couldn't find a point of sympathy for that, but I knew I had to write about it because it was such an ugly and true thing. But as I was writing the novel, part of the reason why it took 10 years is because I had to mature. I was only 30 when I began, and I was 40 when I finished. And that feels ancient now, but like I was trying to come to a point where I had empathy for everybody in the book, so that the pain wasn't Shuggie and Agnes's, but trying to trace it through all the characters to see how they were also hurting. And when I got there, I found I could write the novel with less judgment. I could just write it as it had to be written.
It's interesting to kind of have a non-biased opinion, even though maybe some things have, you know, connections to your personal life, even though the book's not directly linked to things that have happened to you. At Service95, we asked you to, recently actually, for your recommended reading list.
Yeah.
And you very generously provided us with two, one for gay classics and one for working class classics. And you explained that there are very few writers who straddle both genres. And as an adult gay male writer from a working class background, did you feel a sense of responsibility to fill that gap? And how important is it to you to tell these stories?
Yeah, I think there's always the burden of the underrepresented. And because we don't hear enough stories like that, sometimes when you have one, it's meant to speak for everyone. And of course it can't, right? No book can really do that. We're all living such nuanced lives with different experiences. But, you know, like I said, you know, I didn't read books until I was about 17 or 18 because they were actually quite dangerous. They felt, first of all, like they belonged to a society that was down south and middle class. But then they also seemed really feminine, and I was a bit worried that I'd be outed if I like said, I love books. The boys around me would be like, yeah, faggot. You know, they'd be like really terrible about it. And so I kind of stayed away, and I only really started to read them when I was 17 or 18. And then I go on this huge discovery to get beyond the classics and figure out working class voices and then queer voices. And I found often that queer voices were also incredibly upper class or middle class, and they were writing about issues about mobility or about communities that still had the ability to go and find their tribe in capital cities, or to be in a boarding school, or to be in the army, or to up and leave whatever situation they were in. And as a working class person, I didn't have any of that ability. The only universe I knew was the streets that I lived on. Really the only part of the world that I saw Dua. And so if there was any problems with that, I still had to confront it because that was the only place I knew. And I wanted to write with both Shuggie and Mungo, a queer person who was coming to terms with their queerness in a community that's the only community they know.
It's really interesting to hear you say about books being dangerous. I mean, especially now with everything that's happening, there's lots of bans on books that have been happening, lots of writers being censored. I also just, I think it's really interesting. I was having a conversation actually with Min-Jin Lee on my podcast before, on the last season, and she was saying how books are dangerous because the words that we say can actually do something, can actually change. Can change the world, and I think that's also incredibly powerful as well. So I'm glad that you've come to a place to write this incredible story and really, you know, give a lot of nuance and tell a different story as well, in your own story, in your own way. And you know, Shuggie might have taken you 10 years to write, but I guess in the 3 years since publication, like you said, you wrote another best-selling novel, Young Mungo, which is just equally wonderful. I absolutely love that. And there are going to be TV adaptations for both novels.
We hope.
Well, I think that's it's looking good. Which I know that you're currently writing the scripts for.
Yeah.
How does writing for TV differ? And like, I wonder what you gain and you lose in the process of doing that.
Yeah, it's been so wildly different. And at first, when they approached me to do it, I said no, because I felt like I'd given so much of my life to these characters and these books. But then I grew up without books, but we loved stories, we loved telly. You know, we were curious and we were compassionate, and we turned to these sort of film and cinema, and that was how we connected with one another. And so I felt like I had a responsibility to tell these stories on screen and to make sure they were told in a way, even if I fail, and the fear of failure is always with you, but even if I fail, at least I'd done it myself, you know, I'd failed myself. And so it's been such a journey, because the novel has to change entirely because the medium changes. You can't, you know, take the viewer anywhere you want to go. You have to really build the world and show the world. And there's the line that says, if you show a gun, someone has to use a gun. And that's very anti-novelistic, because we just love color. We just love to tell you things for the sake of, you know, telling you things. And so it's been great. And the team at A24 have really helped me to hone my skill and given me a lot of feedback and a lot of space as well to tell the story as it should be told. But I'm hoping one day we can cast you in one of these adaptations.
Oh gosh, I gotta brush up on my Glaswegian accent.
Well, that's what you're doing, yeah. Yeah.
Douglas, thank you so much. This
Thank you.
has been really, really fun.